The day my uncle's attorney called me, a bitter young woman with a personal grudge. I had just finished 3 hours of testimony in a federal courtroom in Charlotte. I counted the number of times he used the word resentment across his cross-examination. 11. I also counted the number of fraudulent invoices his client had filed against the federal government over a 9-year period. 412. My name is Darcy Fenn. And the moment the prosecution stood up and said those words, the government calls Darcy Fenn, federal fraud examiner. I watched my Uncle Victor's face go the color of old concrete. My Aunt Beverly grabbed her purse like she was about to stand up and walk out. My cousin Ashton, who had spent the better part of a decade treating me like a cautionary tale he told at dinner parties, went completely still in his chair. And Victor, the man who told me 2 summers earlier that I was wasting the best years of my life selling 2x4s, sat at the defendant's table in his best suit and did not look away. He watched me walk to the stand. I don't know what he was looking for. Whatever it was, he didn't find it. I'd been working toward that moment for 2.5 years. Let me take you back to where it actually started. Victor Fenn built things. That was his whole identity. The bumper sticker version of who he was in this family and in this city. Fenn Construction had been operating in Charlotte for 26 years by the time any of this happened. Federal contracts, state contracts, public-private partnerships. His company had worked on 3 military base renovation projects in the Carolinas, 2 federal courthouse repairs, and a handful of VA facility upgrades across the region. He cut ribbons at groundbreakings. He gave keynote speeches at Chamber of Commerce luncheons. He had a named scholarship at his alma mater and a seat on the board of a veterans advocacy nonprofit his company sponsored every year. He was also billing the federal government for materials that were never ordered, labor that was never performed, and subcontractors that existed only on paper. But I'm getting there. The summer I was 25, I was in my 2nd year of a forensic accounting program at UNC Charlotte. It was a good program. I was a good student. I was also the kind of student who couldn't leave something alone once I noticed it was wrong. What I noticed was in a case study. My professor had pulled a sanitized version of a real federal audit dispute. A construction company in the Southeast flagged for billing irregularities on a government project. The numbers were anonymized, but the structure of the fraud was clear enough that I could see the shape of it. The markup percentages, the sub-tier vendor patterns, the way certain invoices were timed to land just before project milestone payments cleared. I went home that night and pulled up every piece of publicly available information on Fenn Construction's federal contract awards. The government publishes that data. Most people don't know it exists. Most people who know it exists don't bother to read it. I read it. What I found wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. I brought what I had to my professor, who told me to be careful about making accusations I couldn't support. I contacted the university's academic integrity office, which told me this was outside their scope. And then, 3 weeks after I first started pulling threads, I got a call from a woman named Faye Drummond. She said she was a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Charlotte field office. She said someone on the Procurement Fraud Task Force had flagged a tip that matched a file her team had already opened. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I dropped out of the forensic accounting program 4 days later. My cover story was simple, and as it turned out, almost too convincing. I told my family I'd burned out. Too much pressure, too many late nights, too little payoff. I picked up a job at the Lowe's on South Tryon Street and moved into a cheaper apartment near the airport. My mother worried quietly. My grandmother made a point of not saying anything, which was its own kind of commentary. And Victor was satisfied. He had that particular way of receiving bad news about other people, a kind of slow chewing satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for it and was glad to finally be proven right. She never had the follow-through. I heard him say to Ashton at Thanksgiving that year. He didn't bother lowering his voice. He didn't need to. I was across the kitchen loading the dishwasher, which apparently made me invisible. What nobody at that table knew was that I had been working 20 hours a week as a civilian fraud analyst embedded with Faye's team since September. I wasn't an agent. I had no badge, no authority to arrest anyone, no official title that would have meant anything to my family. But I understood federal contracting billing structures the way most people my age understood their Spotify algorithm. And Faye needed someone who could read what her team was pulling and explain what they were actually looking at. I was also the only person on their side who could get close to Victor Fenn without triggering a single alarm. Because I was just the dropout niece. Nobody watches the dropout niece. The 4th of July party that year was at Victor's lake house on Lake Norman, the one with the dock and the pontoon boat and the fire pit that seated 30. Aunt Beverly had hired a caterer, There was a raw bar and a cooler of craft beer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My cousin Hadley had gotten engaged 3 weeks earlier to a cardiologist from Raleigh, and the whole afternoon had the energy of a party that was really just a long, cheerful announcement of how well the family was doing. Ashton had made partner at his firm. Someone's kid had gotten into Duke, and there I was, holding a Modelo near the edge of the dock, because that was as far from the congratulations as I could get, without actually leaving the property. You know, Victor said, appearing beside me with his old-fashioned, "I've been meaning to talk to you." He had a way of opening conversations that made them sound like a favor he was granting. "I've got a project coordinator position opening up this fall, mostly administrative, tracking vendor invoices, managing subcontractor correspondence. Nothing you'd need a degree for." He looked out at the water. "But it's honest work. Steady pay. I could bring you on directly." He said, "Bring you on the way someone says I forgive you." "I'll think about it," I told him. "Don't overthink it." He patted my shoulder once and turned back toward the party. "Sometimes the right path is the one that's been standing right in front of you the whole time." He moved through the crowd easily, laughing, generous, the polished version of himself he'd been performing for 30 years, and I stood at the edge of the dock and watched him through the fire pit smoke, and then pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted messaging app I used to communicate with Faye's team. I typed 4 words: "He offered me a job." Her response came back in 50 seconds, "Do not accept, but noted." 2 months after that party, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "I know this is strange. This is Piper, Karen Kellum's daughter. I need to talk to someone I can trust. Can we meet?" Karen Kellum had been Victor's in-house accountant for 11 years. I met Piper the next morning at a coffee shop in Noda. She was 24, wearing a Charlotte FC cap pulled down low, and she looked like she hadn't slept well in several months. She had a laptop bag with her, but she didn't open it right away. She didn't order anything. "My mom has no idea I'm here," she said before I'd even sat down. "And I need you to understand. She didn't do anything wrong. She doesn't know what she was processing. That's the whole reason I'm here." "Okay," I said carefully. "Start from the beginning." What Piper told me over the next hour and a half changed everything. She'd been helping her mother catch up on quarterly filing during the previous spring. Just weekends, nothing formal. And she'd come across a set of vendor invoices that didn't line up with anything in the main project management system. Not exactly. The dollar amounts were close. The vendor names were similar to ones she recognized. But the payment routing numbers were different from anything her mother's records showed. And when she searched a few of the vendor company names, she found LLCs registered in Delaware with no websites, no reviews, no physical addresses, and registration dates that all clustered within an 18-month window, about 6 years back. She'd been sitting on a folder of photographs she'd taken with her phone for 8 months. "I kept telling myself I was reading it wrong," she said, "or that there was some explanation I wasn't understanding because I'm not an accountant." She looked at me from across the table. "And then I thought about you. I always thought it was weird that you left your program. My mom used to say you were one of the sharpest people she'd ever seen in a professional setting." She mentioned it more than once. She pushed a manila folder across the table. "I think he's been doing this for a long time," she said. "And I think my mom is the one who's going to take the fall if this comes out the wrong way and nobody's paying attention." "Give me the folder," I said, "and I'll make sure that doesn't happen." I sat in the parking lot for 25 minutes after she left, before I trusted myself to drive to Faye's office. I'll move past the parts that took the longest, because patience isn't what makes a story worth telling. What I'll tell you is what we found. Victor Fenn had been inflating labor and materials costs on federal construction contracts for 9 years. The mechanism was clean, the way simple mechanisms always are. He'd set up 7 shell LLCs across 3 states, Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, all registered with names that closely resembled legitimate subcontractors he actually worked with. He billed for those phantom vendors, fictional electrical crews, materials orders that were never placed, equipment rentals for equipment that never appeared on any job site. The payments routed through accounts that fed back to Victor through a layered series of transfers designed to look like standard vendor settlements. Over 9 years, the total overbilling against federal contracts came to just under $4 million. He also had a contact inside a regional federal procurement office, an auditor named Leonard Greer, who had been approving his invoices without running the verification checks his position required. Greer was arrested the same morning as Victor. And then there was my mother. 8 months before the arrests, Faye called me into a conference room after a team debrief and told me something she'd been sitting on for 2 weeks, trying to figure out how to say it. My mother, Ruth Fenn, who ran a small bookkeeping and payroll service out of the spare bedroom of her house in Concord, had been processing invoices for one of Victor's shell LLCs for 14 months. He'd told her it was a side billing account for a subcontractor he used on smaller projects. He'd given her a fixed monthly retainer. The invoices she processed were fraudulent. There was no way she could have known. I sat in Faye's parking garage for 40 minutes. I couldn't go in, I couldn't drive. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, and I thought about my mother at her desk, in that spare bedroom, inputting line items into spreadsheets she trusted. Because they came from her husband's brother, who she had spent 30 years wanting to believe was a decent person. The arrests happened on a Thursday in November. Victor was picked up at his office building downtown at 8:15 in the morning by 2 agents and a task force officer. He'd been in a budget meeting. I was already at the federal courthouse by then, in a prep room with the prosecution team, going over the sequence of my testimony one final time. His attorney did everything defense attorneys do when the evidence has already buried their client. I was resentful. I had manufactured a grievance and used a federal investigation to settle it. I was a young woman who had never gotten over being underestimated by her family and had confused personal bitterness for professional duty. He said grudge enough times that I started counting automatically, the way you count something when you need to keep your breathing even. What he couldn't explain away was 800 pages of billing records. 7 LLCs traced back to Victor through financial forensics. Piper's photographs, authenticated and entered into evidence, Karen Kellum's full cooperation. She gave it voluntarily and without hesitation once she understood what she had unknowingly been processing for over a year, and the testimony of Leonard Greer, who accepted a plea agreement and spent 2 days on the stand, explaining exactly how the approval mechanism had worked from the procurement side. Victor was convicted on 19 counts: federal contractor fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 12 years. Greer received 5 under his plea. The shell LLCs were dissolved. The fraudulent payments were ordered recovered and returned to the contracting agencies. My mother's accounts were audited within the week of the arrests, and she was cleared within 3 months. Her name was formally removed from any connection to the case. She called me the day Faye gave her the news. She cried in the way people cry when they've been carrying something in the dark for a long time, and someone finally turns on a light. She asked me how long I had known what I was doing, and I told her the whole of it, and she was quiet for a while after that. I always thought it was strange, she said, eventually, that you left school. I know, Mom. You never burned out of anything in your life. I know. There was a man named Gus Malone who had run a legitimate electrical subcontracting crew out of Concord for 12 years. A veteran, retired Army, built the business from nothing after he got out. Victor had used Gus's company name, without his knowledge, as the structural template for one of the shell LLCs. Not an exact match, but close enough that when billing disputes arose early in the investigation, the paper trail created a shadow over Gus's operation. He'd spent 4 months answering questions from federal auditors. His business credit line had been frozen. He'd lost a contract because the uncertainty around his company's name had made a client nervous. He came to the sentencing hearing and sat in the gallery. He didn't say anything to anyone. When the judge read the sentence, he exhaled slowly through his nose and looked down at his hands for a moment, like he was making sure they were still there. I thought about that for a long time after. I found Piper in the corridor outside the courtroom after the verdict came in. She was standing with her mother, both of them very still, the way you stand when you've made it through something you weren't certain you would. Karen had testified. She'd been fully cooperative and received no charges, but she'd also given 11 years of her professional life to Victor Fenn, and you don't spend 11 years somewhere and walk out of a federal courthouse feeling nothing at all. I put my hand on Piper's shoulder. She looked at me and said quietly, "He gave me my first internship 2 summers ago. I thought he was genuinely trying to help me get started. I know. Is it wrong that I still feel bad for my mom? Even though none of it was her fault?" "No," I said. "That part doesn't go away." She nodded, arms crossed tight over her chest, holding herself together with the practiced stillness of someone who had been keeping watch alone for a long time. "I'm a certified fraud examiner now, working full-time on Faye's team. It's not dramatic work most of the time. It's long days reading billing records, reconstructing payment trails, and explaining to attorneys why the routing number on page 47 contradicts the vendor agreement on page 12. I don't talk about the Fenn case much. This is the first time I've put the whole shape of it into words. What I want you to take from it, if you take anything, isn't that I was brave or exceptional. I was 25 years old when I stumbled across something that looked wrong and couldn't unknow it. Everything after that was just consequence flowing from that one choice. The choice to not look away. The people who wrote me off weren't wrong about what they saw. I did leave school. I did spend 2.5 years working a cash register at a home improvement store. From the outside, I looked exactly like the version of myself they'd already decided I was. That was the point. That was the entire architecture of it. Here's what I've learned doing this work. The people who stop watching you have no idea what they've handed you. They think dismissal is the end of a conversation. It's not. It's the moment you stop being a variable they have to account for. And in this line of work, the only thing more powerful than evidence is invisibility.